The air over the Ruhr Valley, November 1943. It is a frigid, moonless black, a canvas of absolute nothingness. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, this darkness was an old colleague. His Messerschmitt Bf 110 felt like an extension of his own body, its twin Daimler-Benz engines a familiar, guttural hum against the crushing silence of high altitude. Below, the searchlight crews painted ghostly, sweeping fingers on the underbellies of the clouds, hunting for the fat, slow British Lancasters he was tasked to kill. His radar operator stared intently into the flickering green glow of his own FUG 220 Lichtenstein display, waiting for the telltale blip. But tonight, the ether was unnervingly quiet. The ground controllers' voices were strained, tight with a confusion that bordered on panic. The bomber stream, which should have been a predictable river of targets flowing along their prescribed route, was simply absent. Yet they were hitting their marks. The distant, angry glow of fires near Schweinfurt proved that. A cold knot tightened in Richter's stomach, a feeling far worse than simple fear. It was the chilling suspicion that the enemy was no longer playing by the known rules. The sky he once commanded now held a secret, and it was watching him. To understand the terror that bloomed in the hearts of German officers in 1943, one must first understand the darkness that preceded it. By 1941, the war in the air had become a nocturnal affair. The Royal Air Force, savaged by the Luftwaffe in early daylight raids, had made a grim calculation. To survive and to strike back at the industrial heart of the Reich, they would have to fight under the cloak of night. The night was their shield, protecting them from the keen eyes of enemy fighter pilots. But it was also a shroud, blinding their own navigators and bombardiers. The challenge was immense. How does one find a single factory, a specific rail yard, in a blacked-out, hostile continent, using only a map, a compass, and the distant cold light of the stars? Initial reports back in Britain were glowing with misplaced optimism. Post-raid analyses claimed success after success. But a quiet, damning report submitted in August 1941 by a civil servant named David Butt revealed the brutal truth. The Butt report exposed the shocking inaccuracy of Bomber Command. It found that on any given night, only 1 in 3 aircraft that claimed to have struck their target had actually gotten within 5 miles of it. Over the heavily defended Ruhr Valley, the number plummeted to a mere 1 in 10. British bombers were navigating a sea of darkness, dropping millions of pounds of explosives on empty fields, forests, and wrong cities. The strategy was failing. In response, Germany had engineered a brilliant and deadly defense. Under the meticulous command of General Joseph Kammhuber, they constructed a formidable electronic barrier, the Kammhuber Line. It was a technological fortress in the sky, stretching hundreds of miles from Denmark down to France. The line was divided into a grid of sectors or boxes, each approximately 20 miles wide. Each box was a self-contained killing ground, managed by a ground control station equipped with Freya long-range search radar and 2 precision Würzburg radars. When a Freya detected an incoming bomber, the first Würzburg locked onto it. The second locked onto a German night fighter scrambled to patrol that specific box. On the ground controller screen, 2 faint dots of light represented the hunter and the hunted. His calm, clipped voice became the invisible string guiding the falcon to its prey. 4 RAF crews flying into this system was like stumbling into a series of invisible spiderwebs. The success of the Kammhuber Line was staggering, and German pilot confidence soared. They were the masters of the night. This mastery, however, was built on a fragile electronic foundation. The British, desperate to break the system, devised a countermeasure of profound simplicity and devastating effectiveness. Window. Codenamed Chaff, it was nothing more than bundles of aluminum strips precisely cut to match the wavelength of the German Würzburg radar. When dropped from a bomber, these strips ballooned into a massive, reflective cloud, creating thousands of false targets. To a German radar operator, the lone, trackable blip of a bomber was suddenly lost in a blizzard of electronic snow. During the massive firebombing raid on Hamburg in July 1943, Bomber Command unleashed Window for the first time. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the defenders. The meticulously organized Kammhuber line was blinded, its ground controllers staring at useless, snow-filled screens, their fighters circling aimlessly. The invisible wall had crumbled. The Germans were forced into a chaotic series of improvisations, but their centralized system of night defense was broken. They had been outsmarted in the electronic war, but the fundamental problem for the Allies remained. Even if you could survive the journey, you still had to find target. This was the complex and evolving battle space the Americans were now entering in force, bringing with them a different philosophy of air power and the seed of a technology that would change everything. While the British had resigned themselves to the imprecise art of nocturnal area bombing, the United States Army Air Forces arrived in Britain with a different, almost defiant, doctrine. They were disciples of precision. Their faith was placed in the heavily armed B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator, and in the legendary accuracy of the Norden bomb sight. Their strategy was bold, bordering on arrogant. They would fight their way to their targets in broad daylight. They believed that their bombers, flying in tight, disciplined combat box formations, could create overlapping fields of fire from hundreds of .50 caliber machine guns, enough to chew through any Luftwaffe fighter that dared to attack. Their goal was not to flatten cities, but to surgically destroy the vital organs of the Nazi war machine: ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, and petroleum refineries. The initial results were calamitous. The theory of the self-defending bomber formation proved to be a costly fantasy. German fighter pilots, flying nimble FW-190s and Bf-109s, developed brutal tactics to break the boxes. They learned to attack head-on, a terrifying closing speed of over 600 miles per hour, firing cannons that could shred a bomber's cockpit in a single, explosive pass. American losses were staggering. On the infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission of August 1943, 60 bombers were lost. 2 months later, a second raid on Schweinfurt saw another 60 bombers fall from the sky. The 8th Air Force was being bled white. The sky over Germany was a meat grinder, and the price of daylight precision was being paid in the lives of 10-man crews who had a terrifyingly low chance of completing their 25-mission tour of duty. Yet, even beyond the lethal swarms of Luftwaffe fighters, the Americans faced a more relentless and insurmountable enemy: the weather. Europe's weather was notoriously foul. For days, sometimes weeks on end, a thick, impenetrable blanket of clouds would stretch from the English Channel to the Polish border. The Norden bomb sight, a mechanical marvel capable of placing a bomb in a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet, was rendered utterly useless. It was a visual instrument. If the bombardier couldn't see the target, he couldn't hit it. Mission after mission was scrubbed on the tarmac, thousands of men and machines held hostage by the overcast. The entire strategic bombing campaign was at the mercy of the meteorologists. The need for a breakthrough was not just strategic, it was existential. Without a way to see through the clouds, the American doctrine of daylight precision bombing was doomed. The answer was not to come from an armory or an aircraft factory, but from a quiet university campus in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In 1940, recognizing the monumental role that new technologies would play in the coming conflict, the U.S. government established the MIT Radiation Laboratory, or RadLab. It was a secret, high-priority project, a gathering of the nation's brightest physicists, engineers, and mathematicians. Their mandate was simple, yet fantastically complex: to explore the military potential of microwave radiation. Unbeknownst to the crews flying into the flak-filled skies over Europe, this group of brilliant minds was on the verge of creating a device that would give them sight beyond sight, a weapon that would finally and irrevocably part the clouds. The war was about to be fought not just with bullets and bombs, but with electrons and radio waves. This revolutionary shift in warfare would be seen from several distinct angles, from the minds who created the technology to the men who had to use it in the heart of battle. Far from the flak and the fury, the war was being fought in chalk dust and the low hum of vacuum tubes. The MIT Radiation Laboratory was a world unto itself, a place where the air crackled with an almost frantic intellectual energy. It was a civilian organization, a curated collection of America's most brilliant young minds, driven by the shared, urgent purpose of defeating the Axis powers with technology. They worked with a relentless pace fueled by coffee and the constant awareness that every day saved in the lab could save thousands of lives on the battlefield. Their holy grail was the cavity magnetron, a British invention that allowed for the generation of powerful, high-frequency microwaves. Their challenge was to tame it, to package its revolutionary potential into a piece of hardware that could survive the bone-rattling vibration, freezing temperatures, and violent chaos of a bomber at 25,000 feet. The result was the H-2X, nicknamed Mickey by the air crews. It was a marvel of miniaturization and rugged engineering. Functioning as a ground-mapping radar, it fired microwave pulses down through the thickest overcast, reading the echoes that bounced back. Cities, rivers, and coastlines all returned different signatures, painting a ghostly, glowing map on a cathode ray tube. For the scientists at the Rad Lab, this wasn't just an engineering problem. It was a moral imperative. They were crafting a third eye, a way to give sight to the blind, and they knew the fate of the air war depended on it. For Sergeant Frank Miller, a bombardier in the 482nd Bomb Group, the world was what he saw through the crystal-clear optics of his Norden bomb sight. His station in the plexiglass nose of a B-17 was his church, the Norden its altar. He was a high priest of precision, trained to caress its gyros and coax its crosshairs into a perfect, steady marriage with a target he could see with his own eyes. Then, in the autumn of 1943, the ordnance men installed a new god in his compartment. It was a squat, anonymous black box connected to a hooded scope that looked like a carnival clairvoyance machine. This was the Mickey set. The training was brief, intense, and shrouded in secrecy. He was taught a new language, not of visual landmarks and drift calculations, but of ground clutter, sea return, and blooming signals. He learned to interpret a spectral landscape of luminous green phosphor. A bright, sprawling shape was a city. A dark, winding line was a river. It felt like witchcraft, a far cry from the elegant, mechanical certainty of the Norden. There was a deep skepticism among the veteran bombardiers. How could this ghostly map of smudges and shadows ever replace the clarity of sight? But as they flew missions where every other group was forced to turn back, and their lead ship, guided by this strange new eye, pressed on into the endless gray, a new kind of hope began to dawn. He was no longer just aiming a bomb. He was interpreting the unseen. His newfound ability to see without seeing was a one-sided miracle. And on the other side, the enemy was beginning to sense a terrifying new presence in their skies. In a quiet, concrete bunker on the Channel coast, a German signals intelligence NCO leans forward, his headphones pressed tight against his ears. His world is one of sine waves and static, a secret language spoken by the enemy. For months, he has been a master of this language, decoding the electronic chatter of Allied bomber streams. But now, a new dialect has appeared. It's not a voice. It's a pulse. A sharp, rhythmic, impossibly fast thump-thump-thump that cuts through the background hiss. It is of a frequency far higher than anything they have encountered before. At first, it is dismissed as a new type of jammer or perhaps an experimental navigation system. But the reports are too consistent. The signal is strongest when the weather is worst. And wherever this strange pulse is heard, a bombing raid follows, striking with an accuracy that defies all logic in zero-visibility conditions. The analyst meticulously logs the signal's characteristics, its pulse repetition frequency, its power, its sweep rate. He files reports filled with technical data, but he cannot provide the one thing his commanders want to know. What is it for? He is a doctor listening to the heartbeat of a monster he cannot see, a sound that is growing stronger and more confident with every passing week. For General Major Dietrich von Sacken, a veteran of the Condor Legion and a seasoned air defense commander, the war had become a battle of predictable physics. His entire strategy was built on weather charts, intercept vectors, and pilot skill. He greeted mornings of thick, unbroken cloud cover with a sense of relief. On those days, the Reich was safe. The Americans would not fly. But in late 1943, the impossible began to happen. A panicked report from a factory manager in Emden. Bombs on target, significant damage, on a day when not a single German spotter had seen an enemy aircraft. Von Socken slams his fist on the map. He calls the meteorological office. They confirm 10-10 cloud cover over the entire North Sea. He calls the regional flag commander. He reports hearing the drone of engines high above the clouds, but seeing nothing. The reports from his signals analysts about strange, high-frequency pulses seem like a footnote until they become a terrifying chorus. His pilots are sent up to hunt ghosts, burning precious fuel patrolling empty skies while below them. The industrial heartland of Germany is being methodically savaged by an enemy who has somehow conquered the weather itself. The general's confidence is eroding, replaced by a cold, gnawing dread. He is facing an opponent who is rewriting the laws of war in real time, and he is utterly blind to how they are doing it. It was a decisive shift that would soon reach its terrible crescendo, not in a single dogfight, but in the relentless, systematic destruction of the Reich's industrial heart. The winter of 1943 to 1944 was meant to be the decisive period of the American air campaign. Codenamed Operation Point Blank, its objective was brutally simple: to smash the German aircraft industry into ruin. The plan was to systematically obliterate the factories that produced the FW-190s and Bf-109s that were savaging the bomber streams. American planners had identified the key nodes, the factories, the assembly plants, the ball bearing works, and they had the bombers to do the job. What they didn't have was the weather. The European winter was a formidable, non-negotiable adversary. Week after week, the 8th Air Force remained grounded, its vast power held in check by an endless, monotonous ceiling of gray cloud. The strategic initiative was slipping away, lost in the fog. This is where the handful of B-17s in the 482nd Bomb Group, the Pathfinder pioneers equipped with H-2X Mickey radar, became the most important aircraft in the entire Allied arsenal. They were the key that could unlock Operation Point Blank. The new doctrine was bold. If the main force couldn't see the target, they would simply follow a Pathfinder that could. The H-2X equipped ship would lead the formation to the target area, flying a precise route based on its glowing radar map. Then, at a calculated moment, the lead Mickey bombardier would drop his bombs. For the hundreds of other bombardiers flying in the formation behind him, the order was simple: when you see the Pathfinder's bombs fall, drop yours. It was a blunt instrument, sacrificing surgical precision for the ability to strike at will in any weather. They called it bombing on the leader, and it terrified the German high command more than any single dogfight. The port city of Bremen, a major hub for U-boat construction and aircraft component manufacturing, had long been a frustratingly elusive target. Nestled on the Weser River, it was perpetually shrouded in industrial haze and coastal fog. On November 26, 1943, the weather was, as usual, abysmal. A force of nearly 500 heavy bombers took off from England, with the primary targets being Bremen and Paris. As they crossed into enemy territory, the cloud cover was total. The formations could barely see their own wingmen, let alone the ground. But this time they did not turn back. At the head of the Bremen strike force flew a single B-17 from the 482nd, its Mickey operator hunched over his scope, his voice a calm, steady presence on the interphone. For the men in the formation, it was an exercise in pure, nerve-wracking faith. They flew for hours into a solid white wall, with only the ghostly shape of the bombers ahead of them as a guide. Flak began to burst around them, the shells exploding blindly in the clouds, the sound a sharp, metallic crack against the fuselage. The German gunners couldn't see them, but they knew they were there. In the cockpit of the lead bomber, the pilot wasn't looking at the ground. He was listening to his bombardier. 10 miles from the IP. I have the river now. It's a clean, dark line. The port area is beginning to bloom on the right. 5 degrees right, steady. Each command was a step in an invisible dance. Then, the final call, bombs away. The lead ship lurched upward as its payload fell into the void. Across the formation, hundreds of bombardiers, seeing the bombs emerge from the belly of the ship ahead, toggled their own releases. Thousands of high-explosive bombs plunged through 10,000 feet of cloud. They were bombing a ghost map, a memory of a city translated into electrons. For the citizens and defenders of Bremen, it was a nightmare realized. The drone of unseen engines, followed by the earth-shattering roar of destruction from a sky that should have been their shield. The Americans were no longer just bombing targets. They were now bombing weather forecasts, and the Germans had no defense against it. This blinding new form of attack forced the Luftwaffe into a desperate and reactive scramble, not just to fight the enemy, but to simply understand the weapon that was now tearing them apart. The German High Command was in a state of controlled panic. The meticulous, orderly system of air defense had been rendered impotent. Reports from the front were no longer about kill ratios and successful interceptions. They were fragments of confusion and dread. The enemy was a ghost, and he was methodically dismantling the Reich's ability to wage war. The Luftwaffe's most brilliant minds were tasked with a single, desperate objective: to unmask this ghost. The answer, they knew, had to lie in the strange, high-frequency pulses their analysts were tracking. If the enemy was using a signal to see, then that signal could be hunted. This led to the frantic development of a new class of device, the radar detector. The most prominent of these was the FUG 350 Naxos. It was a passive receiver designed to listen for and home in on the microwave emissions from Allied bombing radars. Naxos sets were hurriedly fitted to Germany's premier night fighters, the Bf 110s and Ju 88s. The mission for these elite crews was inverted. They were no longer sent to a specific box to await a target assigned by ground control. Instead, they were launched into the storm, their sole instruction to follow the needle. They became electronic bloodhounds, chasing a signal through the very heart of the bomber streams. For a Luftwaffe pilot, this was a new and uniquely terrifying kind of warfare. The hunt was now an act of pure faith in a flickering gauge. He would fly blind into the overcast, his eyes glued to the Naxos indicator. The needle's tremble was the first sign. As it grew steadier, swinging to port or starboard, he would adjust his course, flying deeper into the storm. The drone of hundreds of unseen engines would grow from a faint hum to a deafening, soul-shaking roar that vibrated through his own airframe. He was inside the bomber stream, a lone shark swimming amidst a great shoal of whales, yet he could see nothing. He was flying by instruments alone, praying he wouldn't collide with a friendly fighter or one of the very bombers he was hunting. The final moments of the attack were a frantic, close-range brawl. The Naxos got him into the stream, but it was not a fire control radar. It couldn't lock onto a single plane. The pilot still had to achieve visual contact. He would have to get perilously close, sometimes less than 100 meters, hoping to catch the fleeting, dark silhouette of a B-17 against a momentary break in the clouds or illuminated by the flash of flak. It was a suicidal game of hide-and-seek at 400 miles per hour. While these wild boar, tactics did score some desperate, isolated victories, they were not a systemic solution. They were a costly, chaotic improvisation against a systemic, technological advantage. This frantic, desperate duel in the dark clouds marked the true turning point. A battle not for air superiority in the traditional sense, but a battle against an invisible, all-seeing enemy. A battle the Luftwaffe was now destined to lose. The deployment of H-2X radar was not merely a tactical adjustment. It was a strategic earthquake that shattered the very foundations of German air defense. The Reich's most potent shield had always been its foul weather. Industrial centers deep within Germany could operate with a degree of impunity for long stretches of the year, their factories and workers safe beneath a thick blanket of cloud. That shield was now gone, burned away by the invisible rays of microwave radar. The American 8th Air Force was effectively given a second, all-weather Air Force. The relentless pressure that had previously been confined to clear days now became a 24/7 reality. There was no respite. There was no safe harbor. The impact on German industrial production was slow, creeping, and then catastrophic. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments and War Production, watched his meticulously organized schedules and projections fall into chaos. A factory that was reported secure and productive one day would be a smoking ruin the next, struck by an enemy that no one had seen. The systematic targeting of oil refineries, previously impossible during the overcast winter months, began to starve the German war machine of its lifeblood. Tanks, planes, and U-boats were immobilized not just by battlefield losses, but by an enemy that could now find and destroy the fuel that powered them, regardless of the season. The psychological impact on the German leadership and the Luftwaffe was even more profound than the material damage. It was the crushing realization of technological impotence. For years, German engineering had been a source of immense national pride and battlefield superiority. Now, they were facing a weapon they could not understand, could not counter effectively, and could not hide from. For the Luftwaffe fighter pilots, this new reality was a descent into a special kind of hell. Their kills, once celebrated with honors and accolades, became fewer and farther between. They were sent up into the gray abyss, hunting for an enemy who held all the cards. The calm confidence of the early war aces curdled into a grim, fatalistic resolve. The enemy they were fighting was no longer just a man in a cockpit. It was a disembodied intelligence, a ghost in the machine that could see through their defenses, anticipate their moves, and rain down destruction with impunity. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted. It was no longer a fair fight of pilot against pilot, or even a machine against machine. It had become a fight between a blindfolded giant and an opponent who could see in the dark. The German giant, for all its strength, was being systematically dismantled. The proof of this devastating shift was not just found in the twisted steel of bombed-out factories, but in the cold, hard numbers accumulating in the files of Allied and Axis analysts. The story of H-2X radar's dominance is written most clearly in the dispassionate language of statistics. Allied strategic bombing reports from the winter of 1943 to 1944 tell a stunning tale. Before the widespread use of pathfinders, the number of non-effective sorties due to weather could be as high as 80% on any given mission. Entire bomb groups would take off, fly for hours, and return with their bomb bays full, having never found their target. By the spring of 1944, the numbers had been completely inverted. On days with 10-10 cloud cover, missions that would have been canceled just months prior were now being executed with ruthless efficiency. Post-raid reconnaissance, analyzed days later when the skies finally cleared, revealed the incredible result. Radar-led bombing runs were now placing, on average, over 50% of their bombs within 2 miles of the designated target point, a level of accuracy in blind conditions that was previously unthinkable. The 8th Air Force was now able to prosecute the war on 25 out of 30 days a month, nearly double its previous operational capacity. The ultimate testament to the system's effectiveness came from the enemy themselves. In his post-war interrogations and memoirs, Albert Speer, the man tasked with keeping the German war machine running, spoke with a chilling clarity about the radar's impact. He confessed that while the Luftwaffe could, on clear days, inflict terrible losses on the bomber formations, they were ultimately fighting a losing battle of attrition. It was the all-weather bombing, he admitted, that truly broke the back of German industry. The American strategic air offensive, he stated, was the greatest battle that was ever lost by Germany. The Americans, with their radar, could practically make a timetable of their attacks and destroy one factory after another. This was not the lament of a defeated general, but the cold analysis of an engineer who had watched his intricate industrial system be systematically taken apart by an invisible and relentless force. The German defenses, once a source of national pride, crumbled under the unending pressure. The Naxos-equipped wild-boar fighters scored sporadic kills, but they were a tactical pinprick against a strategic sledgehammer. They could not protect the Reich. They could only die trying. By the D-Day landings in June 1944, the German Air Force that rose to contest the invasion was a shadow of its former self. Its strength sapped, its fuel supplies strangled, and its morale shattered. In large part by the war, it had been forced to fight against an enemy who could see through the very clouds that were supposed to be its shield. This electronic victory marked not just the end of a battle, but the birth of a new kind of warfare, one whose legacy would stretch far beyond the ruins of the Third Reich. The Second World War was a conflict of fire, steel, and human courage. But it was also the war where science became the ultimate arbiter of victory and defeat. The H-2X radar did more than just guide bombs through the clouds. It fundamentally and irrevocably severed the ancient link between warfare and human sight. For thousands of years, to fight was to see. A swordsman saw his foe, a rifleman his target, a pilot the enemy aircraft in his sights. That age ended in the frozen, overcast skies of Northern Europe. The struggle was no longer for control of the air, but for control of the electromagnetic spectrum. The scientists at the MIT Radiation Laboratory, working with chalkboards and soldering irons, had crafted more than a weapon. They had created a new sensory organ. The ghostly, glowing map on the bombardier scope was a crude prophecy, the first draft of a future where battles would be fought with data, decided by algorithms, and waged by machines that see in wavelengths far beyond the capacity of the human eye. The terror felt by the German officers was not just the fear of being bombed. It was the primal, unnerving dread of facing an opponent who had transcended the physical realm, an enemy who could watch, track, and kill from a dimension they could not access. It was the dawn of the electronic battlefield. This technology did not vanish with the fall of the Reich. Its ghost pulse echoes through our modern world. It evolved into the weather radar that guides commercial airliners, the satellite imaging that maps our planet, and the complex sensor suites that direct the drones of the 21st century. The war for the visible world had been won in an invisible spectrum, and in doing so, it opened a new chapter in the story of human conflict, one that we are still writing today.